Now we are going to also make a trip into the Persian period of the Jewish people. So, we have been speaking about the Assyrian Empire, about the Babylonian Empire. Now we are going to speak about the Persian Empire. So for the Assyrians, we had names like Tiglath-Pileser, that was the major emperor for the Assyrians and the one who destroyed Samaria. For the Babylonians, we have Nebuchadnezzar, who was the one destroying Judah and the city of Jerusalem. And now we go with the Persian period. The Persians gather other smaller nations around the east side of the Middle Eastern region. Together with other two regions, they joined together against Babylon, and they conquered the whole territory that was from the Babylonians. And with the Persians, we have three kings which are very important for the Jewish people. The first one is Cyrus. You probably heard about him, Cyrus. The second one is Darius. Darius. And the third one is Artaxerxes. We probably never heard about Artaxerxes, but I heard a lot about him because I studied Nehemiah. So he lived in the period that Nehemiah was the governor of Judah. So with the Persians, we have entered in a period of all the exiled nations going back to their original lands. That was the policy of the Persians. They were the emperors of the nations, but they allowed the exiled people in Babylon to go back to their regions. And for this reason, you will find, for example, praises to Cyrus in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus my servant, etc. You will find praises to Cyrus in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, because he allowed not only the Jewish people to go back to their land, rebuild their cities, restart their life in their own land, but to all the exiled of the other nations as well. So with him, with Cyrus, in the year 538 approximately, we enter in the period of restoration or reconstruction of the nation. And so in this period of reconstruction, we have people who, the Jewish people in three different regions. Not everybody who went to exile went back to the land. Some of them found their own life in Babylon and they continued living there. They didn't come back to Jerusalem or to their their ancestors' lands. So we have people who are still living in Babylon, others who will continue living in Egypt, even though the area was now available and was flourishing again. They decided to stay in Egypt. And so we have people in Jehud or Judah. Jehud now appears the name of Judah as Jehud because the language changed. Before the exile, the Jehudites or the people, the Israelites, they spoke Hebrew. But after the exile and after the Persians, they will start speaking Aramaic. So the name of Judah goes into Jehud because that's the language of the Aramaic language. So we have here different feelings around the deportees, the people who went into exile. Some of them were still feeling angry or with resentment of Babylon for what happened with them, etc. But some of them, they were angry and they wanted revenge. They wanted to destroy these other nations who caused a lot of pain, etc. Some of them entered in crisis of faith. They didn't realize if Yahweh was present or it was a powerless God than the God of the Babylonians and even the God of the Persians. Because the Persians were doing that not in the name of Yahweh. No, they were liberating the people who were exiled in the name of their own gods. Ahura Mazda or no, their own angels, etc. But others had hope, and many of them went back into the land of Jehud and they started rebuilding the cities. The theological problem was that, no, about the God of the Babylonians and the God of other nations. And this is the moment in which Yahweh becomes a God of the universe, because they have to speak of Yahweh or speak of God in terms of a bigger understanding than just their nation or the world, even not beyond this world. Those who stayed in Yehud, what happened with those who never went into exile? Well, they had to find their means, and so they allied with the people in Edom, in Moab, with the Samaritans. They went to work in their lands, they went to look for refuge, etc. And so they married with women who were Moabites, Edomites, Ammonites, Arabs, etc. And the main areas of production were not the cities, but were the lands of agricultural production, so that was the area that became more and more fruitful in those days. The temple, even though the temple was destroyed, the altar of the temple never stopped as a sacred place, and the people continued having their sacrifices, continued having their pilgrimages to this destroyed temple, but they went there. Any sacred place will continue for years and centuries as a sacred place, even though they destroyed the area. And that was very real for me when I went to Samaria to visit the Samaritans there for their celebration. Even though they have the ruins of their ancient temple, they continue having sacrifices there. They still have the annual festivity of the Yom Kippur there, and they go to offer their sacrifices for their own house, for their own children, etc. So the area is still sacred until today. The people in Egypt, they started more in a better situation economically, and they built another temple in Egypt. No, this temple will be in Elephantine, in the south side of Egypt. No, at the beginning of the Cairo, the River Nile, the River Nile, and that area called Elephantine was the area that the Jewish people considered the sacred area or the second Jerusalem, and they had a beautiful temple. And actually, the temple that was in Egypt and the temple that was in Samaria were better preserved, so that we have an idea how it was the Temple of Jerusalem. Today we don't have the Temple of Jerusalem. It went through many battles, wars, etc. It was destroyed over and over and over again. So we don't have actually the measure or the exact place where the temple, the sacred, the Holy of the Holies was. But we have an idea of how it was the construction because of the temple in Elephantine and because of the temple in Samaria. So in this period, we have 3 temples. In Samaria, Elephantine, and in Jerusalem. And there are three proposals of restoration. And these three proposals are reflected in the books that we have in the Bible. There are some groups of the Jewish people who have a more inclusive perspective. How are we going to rebuild our city and rebuild our nation? This is the time in which the people, the Jewish people, were thinking about how is that we are going to come back as a nation. So there was a group of intellectuals or prophets or people who were very religious advocating for a more inclusive perspective. Others had a universal perspective, but not inclusive. And when I said it's not inclusive, it means that they understood themselves as the chosen people in light of the other nations. So they were the ones who were going to rebuild their land, looking at the other nations, aware of the other nations, but this is not including them. And then we have a nationalistic perspective. And this was even a more reductive perspective or proposal of only those who went into exile. It didn't include the Jewish people who were in Egypt, the Jewish people who remained in the land, nor the people who are in other parts of the Middle Eastern area. Only those who went into exile and suffered the exile, only the descendants of those people are the real people of God. And so we have these three perspectives in the Bible. For example, when we speak about the inclusive perspective, we have the book of Ruth. And if you remember in the book of Ruth was written in this period. It was not written in the time before the monarchy, even though the characters of the story are before David, before the monarchy. The book was written in this period as a way of proposing we have to include the Moabites, the descendants of the Ammonites, the descendants of the Edomites, because they helped the people who were starving during the destruction of the temple to survive. And so we have, for example, the name of the husband of Ruth is Machlon, which means weakening. And all the names of the story are very symbolic in reflecting how it was the state of the nation after the destruction by Babylon. And so the two small nations represented by Ruth and Naomi, the two nations are looking for the same objective, life. And they both bring new life together. And this new life will be the ancestor of King David. So the people from this perspective are going back to the history of the monarchy and looking in the archives. How can we convince our people today that we have to be inclusive and not to hate the Edomites, hate the Ammonites, hate the Moabites, and continue hating others. But being in alliance with, and we can be stronger if we include everybody. So, and there is a patriarchal perspective in this proposal, but also we have at the end of the book a very beautiful phrase that is expressed by the women of Bethlehem. The women of Bethlehem tell to Naomi, this woman, your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better for you. It's better for you than 7 children. And 7 means all children or everybody. So it's even better than having 7 children, 7 sons. So how precious is to have the companionship of all these other nations. Among this perspective, we find a female prophet during this period. and her name is Noadiah. Noadiah is found in the book of Nehemiah, chapter 6, verse 14. And this is the only time that you will find about her in one verse, only one sentence. No, but there are so many things we know about this woman by the way that Nehemiah speaks about her. First of all, that there were many types of groups of prophets during this time, and not all the prophets were like one heart and one mind, but they had different perspectives. Some of them were more in the universal perspective, some other more integralist or inclusive, some others were more nationalistic. And so Noadiah is the enemy of Nehemiah because Nehemiah has this nationalistic perspective. And so she is against, and she is probably speaking up against his policies. And so Nehemiah is praying, God, please take care of this woman, no? Who is really frightening me. And then he presents her with another group of prophets, and in the same chapter there are other prophets who are not related with Noadiah. So we have really different prophets, and she was probably one of the integralist or inclusive proposals. She's not accused of false prophecy. She's not said that she's a false prophet. She's a prophetess. She even comes named with Noadiah the prophetess. And so it speaks about the leadership of women in this period. So we have women who are hidden characters, throughout the Bible. We don't hear much of them, only in one verse or two verses, but they are there. And we have to kind of go and clean up the whole text and look at, there are some names around, and we will find, for example, another woman, Hasoferet, who is also a woman that was a leader in these days. So she was probably an activist, and she enjoyed of public recognition. Otherwise, her name will never be in memory of a governor. No, if we don't do anything special, our names are not present in the memories of the governors. Again, although if we keep praising them, probably we will. So then we have another perspective, which is the universalistic perspective. And we can put in this perspective Isaiah. Why? Because the second Isaiah or second and third that we call from chapter 40 to chapter 66, we will find the proposal in the oracles of Isaiah that speak about Jerusalem being the light of the world. And all the nations will come to Jerusalem. From Jerusalem will come the law. It doesn't say anything about the other nations being part of. No, Jerusalem is the light. The chosen people is the center of the law, the center of the truth, the center of religion, and all the nations have to admire and bow down and bring their richness, but they are not going to be included in the project of salvation. So, and we will find that in these chapters from chapter 40 to 66. So these chapters are not reflecting the oracles of the historical Isaiah. The historical Isaiah wrote from chapter 1 to 39, probably. Some of them have also later additions, but most of the first 39 chapters are from Isaiah himself. And in these chapters from 40, we will find the reference to Cyrus as God's instrument. And what the prophet is doing is changing the mind of the people and saying, this is not the liberation or the return to our land or the new rules, the new prescriptions that Cyrus is having is not because his God is inspiring him, it's because Yahweh is using him. So it's our God sending through the instrument or through the foreign kingdoms is giving us salvation, is giving us new life, new opportunity. So these songs that we find in this second part of Isaiah pretty much reflect probably the oracles or songs of many people during this time. And all of these oracles and songs are collected into the book of Isaiah, probably belong to many other people. And because they are written in the form of songs, it says that the people who study Isaiah say that the authors are probably the singers of the temple or singers of the reunited people who came back from the exile and those who stayed in the land, who are now chanting hope and chanting, proclaiming peace. Then we have the nationalistic perspective, of course, with these two guys, Nehemiah and Ezra. Nehemiah from the government or the political perspective, and Ezra from the priestly perspective. And between Ezra and Nehemiah, the proposals that they have is, okay, with the destruction of Babylon, we have no king. We have to look into the descendants. Where are the seeds of King David? And they found the seed in Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the first leader who came back with the exiled people from Babylon into Jerusalem. But then the people didn't accept Zerubbabel and didn't accept his laws. So they kept looking for another proposal and said, maybe we are not called to restore the monarchy, but we are entering into a different era, so we can propose our nation as having two heads, a governor and a priest. So the priest can be in charge of the religious perspective and cultivate the religion in the people, among the people, and the governor can be dealing with more political and social and economical measures. So that was the vision of Nehemiah and Ezra. We don't have to look for the descendants of the kings anymore. We can look into who are good leaders to lead our people in the political milieu, and who are the descendants of Zadok or Aaron, or they were looking into Zadok, Aaron, or Levi as the descendants for having the authority of the priesthood, because the priesthood had to go in the lineage. It was not a call from God to be a priest. That was something that people inherited as being part of the tribe of Levi, the tribe or the descendants of Aaron or the descendants of Zadok. So we have here, among this perspective, we will find two prophets. And these are the two prophets that we are going to study, Haggai and Zechariah. So I guess that they will not be very kindly received because the perspective of these two prophets do not include other nations, are very reductive, and they only have like one agenda: the exiled people, the restoration of the exiled, the rights of the exiled people, and the temple, because those who went into exile were part of the palace and the temple. So with them, the restoration of Israel will happen. So that's pretty much the three perspectives. And And the marvelous thing that we have with the Bible or with the scriptures of the Jews is that they didn't took away the perspectives that were not winners. Finally, the perspective that won was the nationalistic perspective. No? By the blood, and then by our chosen people, only the exiled, etc. But even if they went into power, they win the government, the power, the authority of the people, they did include in the writings the other perspectives. And that says a lot about Israel and about the canon. No, even if they were not the perspectives that won, no, that identify the people, they were not forgotten or thrown out. So who is Haggai? What did you find in the first chapter, first verse of the book of Haggai? Does it says who is Haggai? How does the book of Haggai start? In the second year of King Darius, in the 6th month of the first day, on the first day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Does it say something about Haggai? How do they know it's different? We are entering into a different era. Because even in the other prophets that we have studied, the first thing that we hear is words of Amos, no? Words that God pronounced through Micah, or the words of the prophet Hosea in the year Ta and Sa and Za, and so and so. And now we have even the description of a foreigner king, who is the emperor. In the other books, we have the description of the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah, their local government. But here we have even the colonization of the people, the understanding of the people is that he is our emperor. Darius is the emperor. So we have to start the writing, acknowledging that we are under a conquered land. We are the conquered land of the Persians. The name of Haggai, even though Haggai appears, his name appears offered in the third person. It doesn't say the words of God came to me, Haggai. No, it came to Haggai, this man. No, the name Haggai means festivity or to gather for a festivity or celebration. Hag is feast. In the Greek or in the Hebrew language. Hag Sameach, happy feast day. That's the way they greet to each other. So probably in his name also we have a kind of this priestly perspective that is coming, because all of his oracles are going to be related to the temple or to the rebuilding of the rituals and the rebuilding of the cultic, the cultic practices. The dates of his preaching are very clear, are very specific. We have even the date, the first day of the month, and the 6th month. The 6th month in this case is the month of Elul. In the Jewish calendar is a mess because the year begins with the month of Tishrei. The Tishrei is the New Year celebration, but the first month is Nisan, which is in March. So don't even try to calculate the months. Just for the information, we have a kind of it's a very short period of recollection that we have of his oracles. There is only 2 years, I think, between the time that we have the first oracle and the last oracle in chapter 2. Haggai mentions the political governor or the local governor. We have here Zerubbabel and also the authority of the priest Joshua. So we have the two governments, and in his oracles, in his first oracle, he will address to these two authorities in the first place. So this speaks about the awareness that even though Darius is the emperor, the local governors have enough freedom to do some reforms in their own land. They are not like the Babylonians who had to send men for the troops, send all the tributes or the productions that they had, send the richness of their temples, etc. In this case, the Persians, they allowed the nations to be fruitful in themselves and just to cooperate as much as they can with the Persian Empire. And that was enough for the recognition of the emperor. The book is written in prose. We don't have oracles. If you have seen the book, there are no poetry, no word of Yahweh, word of Yahweh, or Yahweh says, the word of the Lord. Nothing that has a formula or a poetic introduction. Everything is in prose. No title. It has a very concise style. It seems that it was a longer time between the preaching of the prophet and the person who collected all the words of the prophet. And so there are some similarities with Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel was the son of a priest, and his language had so much of priestly influence. In his oracles, for example, in chapter 10, you will see how the presence of the Lord is leaving the temple. And then at the end of Ezekiel, you will see some another reference to how Yahweh's presence is coming back to the temple. Because he lived in between these two times, the beginning of the exile and the end of the exile. So many of the language that we find in Ezekiel, we will also find in Haggai. The structure, it depends how we see the book. There are only 2 chapters, but some people divide in 5 oracles, some others divide in 4 oracles. We are going to consider between chapter 2, verse 10 to 19, only as one oracle. So we have 4 oracles in this case. The first one has the reference to rebuild the temple. And if you see the language that he uses, he will speak that why is that we are suffering of drought and we don't have a good harvest? It's because we didn't reconstruct the temple. So if we rebuild the temple, we will have good production, agricultural production. Why is that we are not living in peace, even though we are back in the land and we are the time of restoration? Because we didn't rebuild the temple. So we have to rebuild the temple. Do not put much of your attention into rebuilding your homes, but rebuild the temple and everything will be okay and peace will be in this land. So that's pretty much the preaching of Haggai in this small oracle. And it speaks about the patience of God. And some of the calls that the prophet expresses are very, very interesting, because it says, how can you live in these paneled houses and your temple is all destroyed and ruins, etc. And some of the preachers of our parishes sometimes use Haggai to speak about, we have to rebuild the temple. We have to do reparations in the chapel. We have to do reparations in the church. And that was really Haggai's focus. That we have to rebuild a specific building so that God will bless us. What is in his mind? There are two things in his mind. First is this theology of retribution. If you do something good for God, then you will be blessed. Then the other perspective that is in his mind is that God only dwells in a sanctuary. God's presence is showed publicly in one specific place, in a specific place. His idea is not that God is everywhere. His idea is that God remains in the temple, so we have to rebuild the temple. How much of our mentality is still there? It has been influenced by Haggai. Some of our members in the church still think that God only remains in the temple building, in the chapel or in a basilica or in a tabernacle. And if it's not, God is not everywhere. And that's the mentality that came through Haggai, and see how many centuries we are living with this mentality. And the other aspect in this oracle, in this area, is to remind that even Pope Francis took the example of this first oracle recently, but to speak in a different way. He said, we have to rebuild the church. And we have to rebuild in a way that we don't have to open our doors, but we have to go out. We have to be a church that goes out, because we have expected that people will come in and make everything to bring to one place. Maybe we have to show the people that God is everywhere, so we have to go out. Una iglesia en salida in Spanish, a church that goes forth outside. So he actually interpreted this oracle of Haggai in his preaching. The second oracle is about the promise of God in the task of rebuilding. Okay, the people, Zerubbabel, Joshua accepted that, okay, we have to rebuild the temple. But then they started, and they didn't have enough resources. And the other nations around, they were mocking about this small group of people trying to rebuild a big sanctuary. And so the people themselves feel that this is not going to happen. And the prophet again goes in a specific day to speak to the people and say, Yahweh is with you. Take courage. Do not fear. So those are the words of encouragement to the people, so that the commitment they have made should continue. And that God will punish those who are oppressing you and those who oppressed you in the past. So that's the second part of the message of the prophet. Then he also pronounces another oracle addressed to the priests. And these are very interesting conversations that he proposes. And the two questions, what are the two questions? Okay, who can read the two questions? Normita. Chapter 2, verse 10.
On the 24th day of the 9th month, in the 2nd year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai. Thus said the Lord of hosts, ask the priest for a decision. If a man carries sanctified flesh in the fold of his garment, and the fold touches bread or pottage or wine or oil or any other food, do they become sanctified? No, the priest answered. Then Haggai said, if a person unclean from contact with a corpse touches any of these, do they become unclean? The priest answered, they become unclean. Then Haggai continued, so is this people, and so is this nation in my sight, says the Lord. And so are the works of their hands, and what they offer there is unclean.
Thank you. The Word of God. So the main message here is about holiness and unclean. No, and it's not about sin, and it's not about sin and the forgiveness of God. It's about unclean and clean, purity, impurity, holiness, consecration, which are more in the area of the rituals and the cultic area. So what the prophet is trying to say is, even though we are building the temple, we are rebuilding this construction, our hands are unclean. So we have to purify our hands. We have to purify our heart, to purify the temple, because our unclean hands are building something sacred. So we have to start festivities or cults and rites, rituals that will speak about the holiness of God, the consecration to God. This is not another building that you have in your house. This is not another building that you have in your in your farm, etc. This is a sacred building. So then the institution of festivities, the institution of pilgrimages, the institution of all the incense and cultic actions will be important. And this is important to remember. No? He's not speaking about sin and forgiveness. He's speaking about the state of our reality as not being God. We all are not God, so we are not holy. We have to be holy by God. No, the holiness comes from the contact with the temple. But if the temple is not pure, how can we have the holiness of God? That's a different language also. Then he addresses to Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, after he addresses to the priests, now he goes into Zerubbabel with the hope that he will remain in power and that his descendants will continue. Haggai is more pro-monarchic, we'll say, even though the monarchy is not the model for the future of these people. He's trying to convince Zerubbabel and convince the nation that this is the way to continue, this is the way to rebuild our nation. Actually, the call is that God is in charge of everything. God is the king, and you are going to be the instrument of God. No? And so there are two titles that he receives, servant and chosen. No? And the servants were the kings in the monarchical period, and the chosen people are those who made the alliance with God in Sinai. No? That's what is coming from Haggai. So what we have as a theology is that this hope that Haggai is trying to communicate to the people who are trying to rebuild their nation, saying that God is in the middle of this. No, even though we are starting from zero now, God is among us. God's presence is in the temple. And so the words of Haggai were used in the New Testament in some of the, no, especially in Matthew. If you go to Matthew chapter 28:20, you will find this word in Hebrew that is Emmanuel. I am with you. I will be with you. God with us. No, and this is coming from Haggai. No, the image of God that stays with us comes from Haggai. But the evangelists in Matthew, they do not speak anymore about the temple, God who abides in the temple, but God who abides in Jesus. No, Jesus is the new temple. Jesus is the new Emmanuel. So it kind of helped to understand us how the Christians, did all the interpretation of the prophets and put the titles. How is that the titles came into the book of the Gospel of Matthew. And then the other quotation in the New Testament is also in Matthew and Hebrews. I am going to shake the heavens and the earth. This idea that God has the power over the heavens, and pretty much later we will see in the cosmovision of the Hebrew people, where was God? God was in the heavens, up there, up. And then he had the power of the heavens, and he also had the power of the earth, in the earth, which was the middle area, and the power over the Sheol, which was the third area, down below the earth, or below where the dead people is. There was no concept of hell or anything like that with the Hebrews. For them, there were three areas. And so God has the dominion of the heavens, of the earth, and also of the Sheol. So, and this is also present in Matthew, in the chapter that is the apocalyptic chapter of Matthew. Before we go into Zechariah, we are going to do our homework, share our homework. Because what Haggai is trying to say to their nation, the messages that Haggai is presenting are not much in the religious building of the encouragement in the religious milieu, but in the political, social, economic interest of rebuilding the nation. And in many of our songs, our nationalistic songs, we also find some of this idea of trying to put God in the middle of our encouragement for a better nation economically, politically, socially. And that's what is present in many of our hymns or anthems or patriotic songs. So, what are some of the songs that you explored? Okay.
In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 10, it says, His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. That kind of reminds me of America, the beautiful song.
Okay, Sister John.
I did America the Beautiful also, and was really surprised to know that many people would rather that song have been chosen instead of the Star Spangled Banner for us to use for our nation. It was written by a teacher when she went up to the top of Pikes Peak and was exhausted at getting there, but when she got there she saw the beauty and the expansiveness really of God. And within it was a poem to start with, and then it was put to music later. And within it, it's really talking about our nation and the broadness of our nation, and talks about God shedding His grace on us. They also pointed out in what I looked up that that Pope Francis used that when he arrived in America and said, "May God shed his grace on thee." All through it, it's talking about God mending the flaws and repairing those things that need to be repaired, like now with the division among us.
I chose the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And you know it. He's trampling on the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. And then all the way through, glory, glory, hallelujah, etc. You know I won't sing it, but anyway.
Why not?
Yeah. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, etc. Now, it's very interesting that this very song, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, was very good at singing this, and they reached 13 in the Billboard's top 40 and in 1959, and out of number 13 out of 40 with those recordings. But in 1960, the choir won the Grammy Award for the best performance by a vocal group by singing this song. So it was during the Civil War, His Truth is Marching On, and mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord were the last words that Martin Luther King gave before he was assassinated in his talk.
I have a reference to Martin Luther King. The hymn that I picked out was "My Country, 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, of Thee I Sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring." Martin Luther, I'm taking a different tone on this one. Martin Luther referred to this song in his famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, and I quote from Martin Luther King. "With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing this verse with new meaning. Our fathers, God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God our King." The abolitionists had another a parody on this song. "My country, 'tis of thee, stronghold of slavery, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, where men our rights deride. From every mountainside thy deeds shall ring." I think it's religious in tone because it challenges us to think about what we're singing and what the view is of our country, the many flaws that we find in it. The hope of freedom takes in all the rostros concretos in our country. We stand at a crossroads now, fighting for the soul of the nation. That's a phrase that Joe Biden uses a lot, but actually the originator of that phrase is Martin Luther King. And our beloved Catherine of Siena urges us to speak with 1,000 voices. It is silence that kills.
Thank you.
I'm surprised that so many of us chose America the Beautiful, which I did also. The hymn starts by praising God for all of the good in our land, and there is so much good, and for all of God's grace. So it's the words itself. I didn't have to search, the people are certainly, the author is certainly thinking of God. The word brotherhood, to me, it just brings out the whole aspect of right relationship. Just the very word. Brotherhood, I can't find it at the moment, even though I have the book open to it. Pilgrim feet. It mentions pilgrim's feet. I have a vivid imagination. I can just see so many people coming toward us, bringing all that they are and all that they have to offer for the rest of us. So, welcoming others. We should be. I hope someday we will be again a welcoming land. And if we really love our country, we will want to share it with the uniqueness. Because of its uniqueness and goodness, we will want to share it with other nations, other peoples. And somewhere in Scripture, I don't have it memorized, is written, for freedom, Christ has set us free. And to be bound or held back or kept a prisoner in any way is against God's plan for all of us, His children. And to free people is what we should be doing. To free people from ignorance of God, ignorance of the truth, and of their own addictions, or from whatever is putting a chain on their lives. That pleases God, to free them from that. And where the song continues, it says, may all success be nobleness and every gain divine. Well, that certainly praises God. They're just the very intention of that. May all success be nobleness, which certainly isn't this day, but someday may we keep working toward it.
Thank you. I notice in some of the hymns in my country, for the flag, for example, or the hymns or the anthems for the army, there are many religious overtones and religious references to the Bible. And this theology of retribution, that God will be with us, God will bless us, and God be with us if we are great with God, or we will vindicate everything with God. With God we will flourish, etc. The same idea that we have today, even in our anthems or some of the references that patriotic songs have in many countries. Those are very similar to what we have in the prophets of the Persian period. Haggai, Zechariah, and those that come in Isaiah, Isaiah from chapter 40 to 66. Those are very similar because it's the time of reconstruction, the time of envisioning what is going to be our land, what's going to be our nation, what's going to be the future for our people. And those desires are also in our anthems, are also in our patriotic songs, in our songs that we have as desiring the best for our nation. So we cannot tell them that these are prophetic songs. Please don't say that. But these are similarities that we find because the oracles from this period are not calling pretty much to the people to their own sins or the transformation of heart, but they are calling to the hope and to the better future. And so before we go, just for the presentation of Zechariah, there are two Zechariahs. The historical prophet, we will find the oracles of the historical prophet from chapter 1 to 7 and 8. 8. No, 7. 8. No, that will be part of the historical Zechariah. And the second part of the book, from chapters 9 to 14, those are oracles that are attributed to the circle of Zechariah, and those are called the Deutero-Zechariah, but probably belong to different periods in the history more into beyond the Persian period, probably more in the Greek period. So those are oracles that are more recent and close to the time of Jesus. So the prophet himself was contemporary of Haggai. How do we know that? Because we will find both of them named or mentioned in the book of Ezra. No, if we read the book of Ezra, there are references to the prophet Zechariah and Haggai. And as the prophet of Zechariah and Haggai said, no, and then there are also some references in Ben Sira or Ecclesiasticus that these two prophets appear close, no, in time, or as if they were working together. But what is not clear is that who is Zechariah's son, or whose ancestors are in Zechariah's line. Because we have the presentation of the prophet here as Zechariah, son of Iddo, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo, no, son of Berechiah. And in Ezra, he appears only as son of Iddo, which in the book seems like is the grandfather of Zechariah. So, and if we go into Isaiah, we will find that there is a man called Zechariah who is the son of Berechiah. And probably from Isaiah, it comes this confusion of who is really Zechariah. And probably the first verse that we find in this book, and also the identification of the prophet, was made later on by people who didn't know exactly the family or exactly the prophet. So we don't know who is the father of Zechariah. If it was Berechiah or Iddo, but they were not alive to give the information, the correct information to those who are studying either. But one of the calls of this prophet is the call to conversion. And here we will find this call to repent, and the main goal of Zechariah is not only the rebuilding of the city and the rebuilding of the temple, but also the rebuilding of the heart, the rebuilding of a restoration of the covenant. But this renovation of the covenant is going to come in terms of practice of the law and practice of cultic tradition, practice of rituals, etc. He's involved in the socio-political situations, and one novelty that we will find in Zechariah is the apocalyptic perspective. And that's telling us pretty much of how the book of Revelation is called, taking some of the oracles from Zechariah to reinterpret the new time of the Christians in light of the prophet Zechariah. So I invite you especially to read from Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7 to chapter 6 to see these different visions. The visions of the four horsemen, the vision of the horns and the blacksmiths, the man of the strings, the vision of the scroll flying out, the vision of the woman in a pot, in a container, the four chariots. These are very appealing to teenagers, because these are very apocalyptic visions. So enjoy with Zechariah and see you next week.
Thank you.